Love is the first and most essential bond, but it's also the invisible thread, woven with time, attention, and tenderness, through consistent nurturing relationships.
Through a series of carefully managed and consistent appearances, the royal institution had been subtly preparing the nation for a significant announcement. Yet almost no one could have anticipated the profound impact of the woman who ultimately materialized before the broadcast cameras. Princess Catherine stepped into the frame entirely alone, locked her gaze directly into the lens, and delivered her inaugural official state address. She executed this with a serene composure that instantly and permanently altered the atmospheric pressure surrounding the British crown. However, it was not simply her solitary presence that captivated the viewing public. It was the undeniable underlying message deliberately threaded through her carefully chosen vocabulary. The parameters of her royal existence had just crossed the threshold into an entirely new epoch. Moments before a single syllable was broadcast to the world, Catherine physically braced herself against the gravity of the occasion. She pressed both palms flat against the surface of the antique desk, briefly closed her eyes, and whispered to a nearby aide that she was ready. The inherent anxiety of the moment had not miraculously dissipated, but she had made a conscious, ironclad decision that fear would no longer dictate her trajectory. Her state address, a formal, televised speech executed as a matter of national royal duty, was a truly unprecedented event, primarily because she was speaking directly to the people of Britain and the wider Commonwealth without the protective presence of another senior royal standing at her shoulder. Then came the precise phrasing that fundamentally shifted the landscape. Catherine formally announced to the nation that she had accepted an expanded crown responsibility. This terminology explicitly denoted a formal institutional duty undertaken directly on behalf of the reigning monarch to project continuity, embody national service, and shoulder select senior engagements during a delicate era of transition. Crucially, she did not frame her evolving role merely as a supportive pillar for Prince William. Instead, she made a solemn vow to serve the crown directly, stepping forward wherever national duty necessitated her presence. The constitutional distinction was impossible to ignore. In an adjacent private room, Prince William listened to his wife's broadcast, his emotions caught in a turbulent crossfire between immense pride and deep, suffocating tension. When Catherine delivered the specific phrase regarding the profound responsibility that the current moment required, the future king quietly lowered his gaze. He possessed an intimate understanding of the reality that the applauding public could not see. Every newly acquired responsibility equated to another inevitable surrender of their private sanctuary, another heavy tax levied upon their family life, and another layer of relentless expectation that Catherine would be forced to absorb. Yet he was also acutely aware that she had embraced those exact words with full comprehension of their cost, a fact that made his silent observation all the more heavy. King Charles had meticulously architected that exact meaning mere hours prior to the broadcast. The reigning monarch had personally reviewed the final draft of the speech and made one surgical, defining alteration. He struck the phrase "supporting the institution" and replaced it with "carrying responsibility for the institution." In the unvarnished lexicon of the palace, the institution is the monarchy itself, its sprawling duties, its historical continuity, and its enduring public role. That single, calculated editorial decision formally transitioned Catherine away from the passive language of spousal assistance and thrust her into the active arena of direct, sovereign responsibility. Queen Consort Camilla decoded the profound significance of this vocabulary just as swiftly as William did. While the general public absorbed the broadcast as a comforting message of reassurance, those residing within the inner sanctum of the crown heard a definitive seismic shift. The Queen Consort understood perfectly that this was not simply a matter of Catherine delivering a speech with eloquence. She was being entrusted with a completely different caliber of institutional power. The true shockwaves reverberating through the palace were not generated by the fact that she had spoken, but by the reality that the inner circle already knew exactly why she had been chosen to speak alone. To understand the gravity of the broadcast, one must look at the hidden events that transpired behind heavily guarded doors before the world ever heard her historic voice. Behind Catherine's flawlessly composed delivery stood four central figures, each processing four drastically different interpretations of the exact same milestone. Prince William witnessed the woman he loved actively stepping into the unforgiving currents of history. King Charles watched the essential future of his monarchy solidify and become visible before his very eyes. Queen Consort Camilla observed the delicate balance of royal attention pivoting in a direction that was now impossible to ignore. And Catherine herself fully grasped that the moment the red broadcasting light switched off, she could never again retreat to being perceived as the dutiful secondary figure permanently positioned one step behind the heir. William had recognized this impending danger long before the cameras were ever positioned. During a hushed private exchange right before Catherine took her seat for the address, he asked her one final grounding question. Was she absolutely certain? She held his gaze for a prolonged moment before softly replying that absolute certainty was a luxury they did not possess, but that duty rarely had the patience to wait for it. The prince offered no counterargument. He merely reached out and held her hand. His lingering hesitation had never been rooted in a lack of faith in her capabilities. It stemmed entirely from his terrifyingly clear understanding of exactly what this elevated responsibility would extract from them both. Catherine carried that sobering knowledge with her as she spoke. She remained, and would always remain, William's most intimate personal partner. But an undeniable transformation was occurring regarding her institutional identity. She was actively evolving into an independent senior principal, a figure whose independent decisions and spoken words carried profound constitutional weight, entirely separate from her role as a supportive spouse. This evolution was critical because the ultimate survival of the monarchy relied on more than just the legal mechanics of succession. It hinged entirely on whether the public organically trusted the specific individuals who would one day wield that staggering responsibility. King Charles had been agonizing over this exact dilemma for quite some time. Through a series of highly classified private dialogues, the monarch had discussed the concept of visible continuity with Catherine. This was the strategic philosophy that the future architects of the monarchy must become deeply familiar and comforting to the public long before any formal, mournful transition of power made their reign an unavoidable reality. King Charles was no longer solely focused on William eventually inheriting the throne. His focus had expanded to ensuring that the incoming generation possessed the power to make the nation feel fundamentally secure in the present day. Camilla experienced this structural shift from a distinctly different vantage point. When the finalized, highly confidential broadcast schedule was delivered to her office, her eyes immediately locked onto the fact that Catherine had been awarded the most prominent, coveted evening broadcasting slot. She scanned the document once, then slowly read it a second time. The Queen Consort placed the paper softly onto her desk and, with an unsettlingly calm demeanor, asked her staff if this had always been the internal strategy. Not a single aide in the room rushed to provide an answer, and that sprawling silence carried a heavy, undeniable confirmation of its own. William continued to privately wrestle with the sheer velocity of the transition. He knew inherently that every new solo appearance would invite a harsher microscopic lens, harsher public judgments, and a shrinking radius of space where Catherine could simply exist as herself. And yet, he also recognized that his father had already begun trusting her with a burden far deeper than mere ceremonial ribbon-cutting. The future king possessed the power to shield her from certain logistical pressures, but he was entirely powerless to protect her from the monumental historical importance that was now being anchored to her name. What the millions of viewers had just witnessed on their screens was not the genesis of this royal transformation. It was simply the moment the transformation was unveiled to the world. The authentic catalyst had occurred weeks prior, during a deeply uncomfortable, highly emotional public engagement that absolutely no one had anticipated would alter the course of royal history. When palace insiders later attempted to pinpoint the exact second the tectonic plates shifted, they inevitably returned to one specific encounter, an encounter that concluded with King Charles rendering a monumental decision in absolute silence. Every era-defining royal pivot features a moment that masquerades as ordinary routine until the lens of history applies meaning to it. Catherine's unprecedented address was born from such a moment. Weeks before the broadcast was ever conceptualized, a standard engagement placed her in a volatile emotional landscape that no meticulously crafted palace briefing could have possibly navigated. There was no glittering tiara, no constitutional pomp, and no sweeping royal decrees. There was only a terrified, grieving family, a completely unscripted conversation, and a watchful king observing Catherine's reaction in a manner he would never forget. Catherine had arrived at the National Remembrance Reception, anticipating a standard, brief sequence of polite greetings before being ushered into the formal royal enclosure. The gathering was deeply poignant, bringing together families who bore the heavy scars of personal loss, designed to honor the broader themes of national sacrifice and unwavering service. This specific demographic mattered deeply, as Charles had been internally questioning how much raw emotional responsibility the younger royals should begin shouldering as his own stamina and schedule inevitably required reduction. He was observing the room with a far sharper, more analytical eye than anyone present realized. Suddenly, the rigid, highly choreographed timetable completely fractured. A young, recently widowed mother began sharing the agonizing details of losing her husband with Catherine, and mid-sentence the woman was overcome, struggling desperately to breathe or continue. In that fraction of a second, the Princess of Wales simply stopped moving. Instead of offering a practiced, sympathetic platitude and swiftly moving down the line to maintain the schedule, she anchored herself firmly beside the widow. She deliberately ignored the frantic, subtle gestures from her security and aides, allowing the raw conversation to unfold entirely at the grieving mother's fractured pace. Catherine made no attempt to rush or sanitize the woman's grief, and slowly the widow began to steady herself under the princess's patient, unwavering attention. From a distance, William observed the delay. His initial reaction was a spike of protective concern, which rapidly melted into profound pride. He knew intimately how quickly an unpredictable, highly charged emotional encounter could either overwhelm his wife or be twisted and misunderstood by the watching press. Yet as he watched Catherine channel all of her focus into creating a safe perimeter for the grieving mother, his anxiety evaporated. She was not executing a theatrical performance of royal compassion. She was simply, stubbornly refusing to abandon a human being in the epicenter of their pain. King Charles witnessed the exact same interaction from only a few paces away. Later that evening, after the reception had formally concluded, the king ensured the heavy doors of a private drawing room were firmly shut, speaking with William with absolutely no advisors present. The monarch confided in his heir that Catherine possessed a rare, unteachable quality. No amount of brilliant PR briefing or palace spin could successfully manufacture authentic public trust if it appeared to be demanded by the institution. Trust had to be organically earned and deeply felt by the populace before any future transition of power asked the country to swallow massive, unsettling change. That very night, Charles transitioned from quiet observation to decisive action. He instructed his private secretaries to draft formal options for a direct national television address, initially pitching the concept as a symbolic gesture of national comfort. However, within a matter of days, the scoop of the project ballooned. The monarch determined that he wanted Catherine to speak directly to the concepts of continuity and service, but to do so in a manner that tethered genuine institutional responsibility to her words, elevating it far beyond mere ceremonial fluff. William grasped the origins of the strategy immediately. Catherine had never once campaigned for a louder voice or a larger platform. Ironically, it was her very refusal to ruthlessly seek the spotlight that was now convincing the king to trust her with the brightest spotlight of all. The strategy appeared to be fully locked in. But then, a senior royal boldly challenged the entire foundation of the plan, dragging the unspoken elephant into the center of the room. The uncomfortable question was finally vocalized. Was Catherine still operating as a supportive mechanism for the future king, or had she amassed enough individual power to speak as the voice of the institution itself? Within the palace walls, conflict rarely manifests as shouting matches. It takes the form of suffocatingly long pauses, impeccably polite but razor-sharp questioning, and a chilling collective realization that everyone present knows exactly what is truly under threat. As Catherine's proposed state address entered its final logistical planning phase, a highly confidential meeting violently ripped the polished veneer off the underlying institutional tension. What commenced as a dry debate over broadcasting protocol swiftly devolved into an intensely personal confrontation regarding relevance, sovereign visibility, and the ultimate architectural layout of the monarchy's future. Camilla locked eyes directly with Catherine and flatly refused to dilute her inquiry. She asked point-blank if Catherine truly comprehended how a solitary, standalone address would be weaponized and interpreted by the public once they saw her commanding the screen without William at her side. The Queen Consort was not casting doubt on Catherine's eloquence or ability to deliver the script. She was directly challenging the terrifying precedent it set, the irreversible example a royal action establishes for what the public will demand in the future. Once Catherine claimed that solitary authoritative space, the symbolic meaning could never be quietly stuffed back into a subordinate box. Catherine did not flinch, nor did she retreat. She responded with absolute clarity. She understood precisely how it would be interpreted, which was exactly why she refused to treat the undertaking lightly. Her steady response instantly dropped the temperature of the room, primarily because she refused to deny the massive scale of the maneuver. She owned it. For King Charles, this ownership was paramount. This was no longer just about executing a flawless PR broadcast. It was a stress test to determine if the monarchy could successfully preview its future power structure to the public without making the transition feel aggressively forced or deeply unnatural. Sensing the exchange sharpening into a blade, William shifted his weight forward, fully prepared to interject and shut the debate down. But before he could speak, Catherine raised a single hand slightly in his direction, a silent but absolute command to hold his fire. She required zero protection in that boardroom. If her evolving role demanded independent sovereign responsibility, she was obligated to defend her own right to hold it. The prince halted, studying her profile with intense focus, realizing that the woman he married was already operating on a vastly different frequency when placed under constitutional pressure. Camilla, however, pressed the issue further. She articulated that the very survival of the crown was reliant upon strict hierarchy just as much as it relied upon public affection. She warned that immense popularity and publicity must never be allowed to quietly mutate into a constitutional expectation. In the rigid world of the palace, hierarchy is the unyielding order of rank that prevents the chaos of personal charisma from overriding established formal authority. Her underlying fear was transparent. Public admiration could easily curdle into public expectation, and unchecked expectation possesses the sheer force to completely redraw the map of royal power. It was King Charles who finally dropped the gavel on the debate. He calmly placed his pen on the table and declared that the broadcast would proceed exactly as planned. There would be no logistical compromises, no softening of the script, and no shared screen time. His final ruling hammered home one undeniable reality. Catherine's unprecedented elevation was not the accidental byproduct of media popularity or a lucky string of headlines. It was being surgically, deliberately authorized by the very heart of the crown. William remained silent for the remainder of the meeting, but his silence was pregnant with a much larger, looming dilemma. King Charles possessed the authority to open this door, but it would ultimately be the future king who had to decide whether Catherine's newfound authority would serve merely as a temporary heat shield for the current monarchy, or if it would become a permanent, foundational pillar of their eventual reign. The most seismically important decisions within the royal family are nearly always forged in rooms devoid of cameras, public applause, or historical witnesses. In the wake of the boardroom confrontation, William found himself facing a deeply personal choice, steeped in monumental constitutional symbolism. He could passively allow Catherine's address to exist as a one-off anomaly sanctioned by his father, or he could proactively weaponize it as a glaring declaration of exactly how he intended to govern and share power when his own era commenced. He understood the stakes perfectly. The survival of the monarchy he was destined to inherit would not merely rely on the public's confidence in him as the sole sovereign.
it would rely heavily on the nation's absolute trust in the partnership that fortified that sovereign. In practical terms, a royal household is the complex breathing machinery of staff, scheduling, and protocol built around the senior principals. If Catherine was genuinely expected to stand as his equal partner in the future, her institutional authority could no longer remain perpetually eclipsed by his shadow. When they were finally alone, Catherine voiced the exact hesitation she had sensed in him during the meeting. The prince confessed that a protective part of him still desperately wanted to shield her from becoming utterly indispensable to the firm. He knew the tragic history of royals who became the vital organs of the crown. Their time ceased to be their own, their private sanctuaries evaporated, every absence sparked a crisis, and every fleeting moment of human frailty was dissected for public consumption. Catherine met his confession with the exact same unnerving clarity she had deployed against the queen consort. She gently told him that running away from the responsibility would not magically refund their lost privacy.
It would only mean they were allowing fear to dictate the shape of their destiny. William studied her face for a long, silent moment, refusing to rush the gravity of his response. Finally, he spoke quietly. "Then we do this together." That single sentence triggered an avalanche of administrative change. William immediately commanded his household staff to begin processing Catherine as an independent principal for major selected state engagements. This meant she was now a senior royal whose massive duties were to be conceptualized, budgeted, and executed entirely in her own right, rather than merely being bolted onto her husband's existing itinerary. It was a dry, bureaucratic adjustment that carried earth-shattering symbolic weight. Furthermore, William issued one non-negotiable ultimatum regarding the state address itself. Catherine's authentic voice must not be scrubbed away by palace speechwriters. He aggressively vetoed any draft phrases that felt overly grandiose, ceremonial, or alienating to the common citizen. He insisted she speak of endurance, human responsibility, and shared sacrifice using her own cadence and vocabulary, rejecting any sanitized document designed purely to deflect media criticism. Catherine knew this was vital. If the public was going to buy into the message, the words had to feel genuinely lived, not focus grouped. As soon as the finalized script was locked in, the sprawling, slow-moving machinery of the palace began to violently pivot around this new center of gravity. The atmospheric shift was instantaneous. High-level invitations, classified diplomatic briefings, and critical policy decisions began flowing into Catherine's private office in a completely unprecedented order. Previously locked doors were swinging wide open, and competing royal offices were rapidly taking notes. The broadcast itself lasted only a matter of minutes, but its shockwaves detonated instantly. Before Catherine had even stepped out from under the studio lights, encrypted phones were already buzzing frantically across the various royal households. International diplomatic desks were aggressively demanding official transcripts, and veteran staff members were scrambling to decipher if they had just witnessed a touching one-off ceremonial tribute or the brutal, permanent redistribution of royal power. Within the palace corridors, however, one specific logistical reaction spoke volumes louder than any official press release. Catherine's televised promise to carry responsibility was immediately interpreted as a green light for her office to command greater jurisdiction over major national and Commonwealth affairs. Commonwealth engagements carry staggering geopolitical and symbolic weight, connecting the crown to nations bound by deep historic ties. Within the hour, vital briefing dossiers began bypassing William's desk entirely, rerouted directly to Catherine's team. Camilla felt the blunt force of this new reality in the most acutely personal manner. Retreating to her private sitting room after the broadcast, she fully expected the quiet peace of the evening. Instead, a private secretary entered bearing a freshly updated master engagement file, which prominently listed Catherine as the absolute lead for a massive forthcoming national service initiative.
The queen consort read the briefing paper, slowly removed her reading glasses, and remained completely silent. That absolute stillness was far more revealing than any outburst of anger could have been. The new hierarchy was no longer an abstract debate. It was being printed in black and white on the daily schedules. Catherine, meanwhile, was experiencing an entirely different emotional fallout. Far from basking in the glow of a triumphant performance, she turned to William with genuine anxiety and asked if she had sounded too arrogant or overly certain. The vulnerability of the question briefly stunned the prince. The woman who was currently being heralded across global news networks as the ultimate bedrock of national stability was second-guessing every syllable she had just uttered. He softly reminded her that projecting bulletproof certainty was never the objective. She had been tasked with projecting responsible leadership, not robotic invulnerability. The public had connected so viscerally to the speech precisely because her deep humanity was visible just beneath the surface of her authority. Before the media noise could escalate further, King Charles dispatched a private, handwritten message to Catherine. In just a few scrawled lines, the monarch imparted that true authority is always at its most unshakable when the person wielding it remembers exactly who they are supposed to be serving. She read the parchment twice.
To her, those quiet words carried infinitely more validation than the screaming headlines of the press, because they proved that this agonizingly heavy responsibility was never bestowed as a vanity project. It was a mandate for service. William was soon hit with his own realization, as international news anchors began aggressively branding Catherine not just as the Princess of Wales, but as the undeniable, undisputed symbol of the monarchy's next era. The future king recognized both the incredible power and the terrifying danger buried within that narrative. Unprecedented public confidence acts as a titanium shield for the crown, but it simultaneously erects a towering monument of expectation that no human being can easily survive. Before Catherine could fully process the media tidal wave, Charles summoned her for a strictly private audience, entirely insulated from the hovering presence of strategists, press secretaries, and aides. The king intended to explicitly articulate exactly why he had thrust her before the nation in such a vulnerable, solitary manner. After weeks of exhausting protocol, fierce internal debates, and meticulous staging, the true climax of the narrative unfolded in a silent room with no audience. For the first time that evening, the heavy veil of ceremonial protocol was entirely lifted between them. Charles was no longer addressing a subordinate royal colleague. He was speaking directly to the woman who would inevitably stand beside his son when the crushing absolute weight of the sovereign crown became theirs to bear alone.
He did not open the conversation with empty flattery. The king bluntly confessed that the television address was never designed as a temporary band-aid to soothe the nation for a single night. His master strategy required the public to forge a deep, unbreakable bond of familiarity with the architects of the future before the trauma of sovereign change made it an unavoidable reality. He knew intimately that blind public trust cannot simply be demanded or artificially manufactured at the 11th hour of a crisis. Catherine absorbed his words carefully before confessing the deep anxiety that had plagued her since the cameras cut to black. She admitted her fear that the solo address might be perceived by the public and the family as deeply presumptuous, as if she were aggressively seizing a throne that was not yet hers to claim. Charles shut down her fears without a microsecond of hesitation. He told her that this exact, agonizing reluctance was the precise reason he knew she was ready for the burden. Those who blindly chase after power almost always fatally misunderstand its true cost, while those who are terrified by the sheer weight of it are the only ones fit to carry it without dropping it. The king then allowed the rigid boundaries of the monarchy to soften into something deeply human.
He verbally acknowledged the staggering, heartbreaking sacrifices that Catherine and William had already laid at the altar of duty, the evaporation of their privacy, the theft of ordinary family moments, and the permanent loss of the freedom to simply make a mistake without sparking a global scandal. He knew William had fought a losing battle to protect her from that life, and he knew Catherine had bravely, repeatedly accepted it anyway. Catherine's eyes shone with unshed emotion, but she remained silent, allowing the monarch to speak. For the very first time in her royal tenure, the excruciating personal cost of her life was being spoken aloud and validated by the sovereign, rather than just being silently, ruthlessly demanded. Then, Charles delivered the final, cementing confirmation. He explicitly told her that the broadcast was not a standalone PR stunt, it was a permanent, structural turning point. She would continue to be delegated massive, high-stakes responsibilities entirely in her own right, not merely as an extension of William's existence. This decree was not designed to wedge them apart, but to fuse them together, preparing them to shoulder the ultimate burden as two distinct, formidable leaders, trusted both as individuals and as an unbreakable unit. When she quietly asked what he ultimately demanded of her, the king provided the most profound directive of the night.
He did not want a polished, hollow imitation of past royals.
He needed her to remain fiercely, recognizably herself when the pressure reached its most agonizing peak, because her authentic humanity was the exact currency the public had already begun to trust. Catherine departed that room with absolute crystalline clarity regarding the palace's long-term blueprint. However, while the palace possesses the power to allocate duty, it cannot dictate the hearts of the public. As the clock edged toward midnight, the deeply guarded, private intentions behind her speech violently collided with the raw, unfiltered reaction of the nation, culminating in a single defining image that would echo through history. Long after the broadcast had concluded, the narrative had been entirely hijacked from Buckingham Palace. It now lived in the frenzied debates of television studios, the glaring ink of newspaper front pages, and the breathless commentary of millions dissecting her every pause and inflection. Yet, cutting through the deafening roar of expert analysis, one profoundly simple human interaction captured the true magnitude of the night. Masses of strangers congregating in the cold night air outside the palace gates, applauding a woman hidden deep within the walls who could not even hear them. Watching the live feeds with Catherine, William found the sheer scale of the reaction almost immediately overwhelming. Pundits across the nation were breathlessly debating the constitutional implications of a Princess of Wales executing a solo, state-level address, a format historically reserved for the sovereign.
The media was unanimously declaring that the next generation of the monarchy was no longer waiting in the shadows. But when the commentary inevitably pivoted to dissecting the immense personal sacrifices Catherine had made, William quietly reached for the remote and muted the volume. Catherine noticed the gesture, but did not ask him to restore the sound. Her encrypted devices were already flooded with deeply personal messages from citizens thanking her for speaking so candidly about the endurance required for duty and service. People were projecting their own private traumas, losses, and fears onto her words, finding genuine solace in her delivery. With every incoming message, the princess grew quieter. She realized the response had transcended mere approval of a royal performance. Total strangers were now anchoring their own fragile hopes to her existence. Outside the imposing iron gates of Buckingham Palace, the atmosphere was crackling with an energy all its own. What started as a handful of tourists had swelled into a dense, emotional crowd. In the sea of faces, one woman hoisted a hastily scribbled piece of cardboard bearing 5 devastatingly simple words. "Thank you, Catherine. We heard you." When the warm glow of the palace windows remained illuminated against the night sky, a spontaneous, uncoordinated wave of applause erupted from the crowd, rippling through the cold air as strangers clapped in unison for a leader they could not see.
When an aide quietly informed William of the scene unfolding at the gates, he glanced at Catherine but chose to keep the information to himself for the moment. He understood the terrifying weight of that applause. While the royal family was accustomed to the cheering of adoring crowds, this phenomenon was entirely different. This affection wasn't born of celebration, pageantry, or a royal wedding. It was forged in the fires of assumed responsibility. The future king knew that this specific, heavy brand of public trust is the only thing that can guarantee the survival of the crown, but it also places a soul-crushing, suffocating expectation on the shoulders of the one who must carry it. The physical proof arrived with the morning papers. Catherine stared blankly at the staggering front pages laid out before her. One publication featured a massive, stark portrait of her face beneath the towering headline, "Her Moment." Another broadsheet simply declared, "The future speaks." She examined the ink without a trace of a smile. The midnight applause was moving, and the morning headlines were historically unprecedented, but she knew neither represented the final verdict. The true, unforgiving judgment of history would only be rendered based on how she survived the grueling decades after the initial excitement evaporated. Yet, as the sun rose on a new royal era, one fundamental truth had been carved in stone, impossible to erase.
Catherine had walked into that broadcasting room as a senior royal, and she had walked out carrying a mandate that was infinitely heavier. History does not always announce its arrival with the deafening trumpets of a coronation or the signing of a constitutional treaty. Sometimes it slips into the room through the steady, unwavering voice of a woman brave enough to shoulder the terrifying uncertainty of the future on behalf of an entire nation.
Her inaugural state address was a watershed moment because it boldly illuminated a truth the monarchy had spent years meticulously engineering but had never dared to say aloud. The next crucial chapter of the British crown would not and could not be built upon William's shoulders alone. Catherine had officially, undeniably become the emotional and structural bedrock of the institution, and every single player on the board now understood the new rules of the game. When the deafening noise of the world finally began to recede, Catherine sought out William in the quiet of their private quarters. The prince looked at his wife through a profoundly altered lens. It wasn't that the woman he loved had miraculously transformed overnight. It was simply that the entire globe had finally been forced to witness the staggering strength he had privately relied upon for years. She had anchored a nation without needing to hide in the safety of his shadow.
This reality was paramount, because a future queen consort is not merely a decorative title printed next to a king. It is a massive, active, public weapon capable of injecting lifeblood and confidence into the crown precisely when the terror of uncertainty threatens to tear it down. In the silence of the room, William asked her the most vital, grounding question of the last 24 hours. "How do you feel?" Catherine allowed a long breath to escape, feeling the crushing tension finally begin to drain from her posture. She looked at him and answered simply, "Tired, but certain." For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the heavy air broke, and they both shared a quiet, genuine laugh. It was a painfully small, wonderfully normal human moment, yet it was the most important moment of all. Stripped of the crushing authority, the suffocating expectations, and the grand historical theater, they were simply two partners realizing that the terrifying, monumental future they had spent their lives preparing for was no longer a distant theoretical concept. It had arrived. The following morning, King Charles experienced a much quieter, more solitary revelation. Reviewing his daily briefings and staring at Catherine's commanding presence dominating every global news cycle, he did not pop champagne or celebrate the media victory. He simply stared at the image, exhaled a long breath of tension, and muttered to an aide that she had carried the burden flawlessly.
His quiet relief laid bare the agonizing stakes of the entire operation. The desperate gamble for continuity, the delicate, dangerous alchemy of transferring the public's fragile trust from his aging generation to the vibrant youth of the next, was no longer a desperate hope. It was a tangible, breathing reality. Queen Consort Camilla had also fully internalized the shifting of the tectonic plates. She knew Catherine had not staged a coup or forcefully usurped anyone's rightful place. However, it was now an indisputable fact that a massive, undeniable secondary sun had ignited within the solar system of the monarchy. Every future logistical schedule, every charitable initiative, and every constitutional decision would now be forced to orbit around this new reality. She was free to privately lament the breakneck speed of the transition, but she was no longer foolish enough to deny that the transition was complete. Ultimately, Catherine's true historical triumph was not found in the unprecedented power she had been granted, but in the exact manner she chose to wield it. She never once paraded her new authority as a weapon or a vanity project. Instead, she managed to make the concept of duty appear infinitely heavier, the reality of personal sacrifice more visceral, and the brutal grind of public service vastly more important than the glittering illusion of royal status. Her historic broadcast had begun in a crucible of fear and uncertainty, but it concluded with absolute, unshakable clarity. King Charles had bravely chosen the path of continuity.